All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Access Succeed. This is Gearface. I am joined today for the final time by Andarel. Andarel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. Andarel has finally gotten sick of my guff, and we've decided to part ways after a fruitful relationship. By which I mean we've run out of characters for him to cover. Today we are covering Devris, one of the promo bonus characters from season one. So going back a little ways for this one. Couple disclaimers before we get started. As always, number one, we are going to be talking about playing to win on this show. That is not the only way to play Exceed. You can play Exceed for fun, and I encourage you to. If the lines of play that we're describing aren't fun to you, don't play that way. As a matter of fact, because this is a season one character, if you are looking to play Devris to win, you may need either a time machine or a legacy tournament. He has been rotated out of competitive play for quite a long time. Doesn't mean the stuff we're going to be talking about is less relevant, just something to note. Um, Disclaimer number two, we're going to be pretty prescriptive about strategy on the show. You will hear Andarel say things like, this is always true. This is always the way to do it. This is never the way to do it. This is always what you want. Even though Devris is an old character who has sort of been through the paces and people really understand how he works, don't think that means that he is completely solved, that anything about Exceed is a solved game. We are going to be going over the rules to Andarel's strategy with Devris. They don't have to be your rules, and I encourage you to find your own play style and prove us wrong in all of our evaluations. But yeah, all that said, Andarel, please tell me a little bit about Devris.
So Devris is weird. Like I'm just gonna open with that. He is a very economy heavy character. I mean, unlike the other season one characters that we've talked about, who Alice and Juno, who are kind of busted. Devris is he's a character that people have occasionally thought is like this character might be busted, but he's never really. It's never proven to be true in practice. If that makes sense,
He's
he's
never
very
he's never
complicated.
he's never ascended quite to that level.
Yeah, and so the thing about most of the season one like busted characters is they've just got like insane buttons. And Devers has real costs. Like he's got really big effects. He's got really big spends. He's got like kind of clunky cards that are potentially really powerful, but also weird.
Okay.
And does like a good job with that. There's not that many characters like him, and he's really fun. He's pretty balanced, and if you feel like playing him casually or in any non-rotated band format, I highly recommend it.
I
You
remember a couple months ago, Andrel, you and I and Blue were just talking about Exceed design in general, sort of independent of power level, independent of strategy and stuff. And I think you mentioned that Devris is one of your favorite season one designs.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the most interesting designs probably in all of Exceed, because his design has sort of gotten more common over the years. Like season one and two didn't really play with economy. You tended to have the resources to do stuff, or like had no resources at all. There wasn't like the big spend as a character archetype for the most part.
Right. Sure.
See, like you had the characters who just had insane costs, like Jeanette's a good example, and were like overwhelming, but there wasn't that like kind of season five-esque spend a bunch of resources and build these widgets. And then season three didn't really have that, and then it started getting really popular in season four. But I feel like the real example of the character who like just vomits resources and then has to deal with the consequences is Devris.
Okay. So I
Um,
should expect to have a lot of stuff, but that doesn't mean that I'm not on a budget because everything that I'm gonna do is really expensive.
Yeah, and so the sort of key to all this is Devris's ability, and everything else kind of falls out of that. So his ability is a lot like Giles.
Hmm.
Is when you spend your gauge for force, every gauge spent provides up to two force instead, up to two because of the ultra condition, right? Like if you were to change cards one, you couldn't change CC one with a single card if it was forced to provide two. So it's up to two force, and then as an action, you can spend a life to get a free gauge, basically, or not free. It's a takes an action and a life. So, and then in Exceed mode, just to sort of speed things up, because Exceed is very similar, it's now provides up to three force instead.
Okay. And
So
the other part of the ability is the same.
other part's the same.
Okay.
So what this means is that once you have gauge, you can generate force like crazy, right? So
Right.
Infernal Armor is two cards. Infernal Power is three cards. Moving two is one card. Your gauge expenditures are like really really good.
Right. And
The problem
so
is,
you
yeah, go
made
ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You made the comparison to Guile, who has a similar sort of gauge for force rebate. His only applies to the first gauge you spend. For Devris, if you have, you know, 10 gauge, that's 20 force, right?
Correct, correct.
In a turn, you don't need to meter it out over several actions or anything like that.
Right. And so the
Okay.
problem, though, your force expenditures are like attack, attack, boost, attack, boost, attack, sort of, and then attack.
So
Like all of your
everything that I'm doing has something on it that is going to cost cost me some money.
yeah, everything that
Okay.
you're doing is pretty good, and everything that you're doing costs force. So that's where you stand, right? Like your economy tends to translate force into useful stats, but the way to get force is to get gauge, and the way to get gauge, that's the hard part.
Okay.
So so you have this weird sort of complex multi-stage economy that lets you really deal with just like shoving cards into your gauge, turning them into force, and then rolling with it.
Okay.
So how do you play as Devris? The answer is like legitimately it's complicated because your cards are really good, but they're also really specific. So so this actually might be kind of an unusual one where we may want to just talk about like card shapes, and then kind of go back into it. So you've got so Phantasmal Might is basically a mid speed, like a
Right.
close range mid speed.
Hits
Um,
for 6, slightly under curve at 2.
yeah.
Okay.
Summon Assailants is a cash out and punishment card, especially against Rangers. We'll get back to this card because this card's really important. Drain Life is a like pseudo slow. It beats a lot. It like beats a lot of fasts, but has some issues. Mark for Death is like a super reliable slow because it's a 1 to 6 sweep basically, um, with less guard and less power. Combustion is a payout card. It hits it's like a M Bison card, 2 to 3 6 6 or whatever.
Okay.
And then your ultras, this one is a combo extender slash fast slash weird counter poke, and then this is just a big damage speed. So you'll notice, like, just from that brief summary, his cards tend to be pretty varied. You know, he's not that fast inherently. His only fast cards are Combustion and Firestream, and really only once they're set up. Um, but your goal is kind of like your cards are specific, and they're quite good at doing the specific thing they do, as long as you have the force to make them work. So you have to kind of manage that, if that makes sense.
Okay. Other characters who have like a specific set of options that work in specific ranges, but don't really have like cross applicability of when you'd want to use them. They're limited by just their cards. I'm limited by that, but also by the fact that I need to be pumping any of these full of force to make them
Basically,
be
yeah,
useful.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, and so let's talk about cards, and we'll actually just go through his UA as it applies to the cards, and then sort of talk because it doesn't really do anything on its own. Um, so the one thing to mention, so the second action. So as an action, you can spend a life to have the top card of your deck to gauge. That's a pretty bad action, right? The most comparable example is like M Bison action, where it's as an action you can spend a card basically from your hand to your gauge,
Right.
which is way way better because I think it replaces itself. And yeah, it's just way better. One important thing though is that you see how he's a 2 gauge exceed. Whenever you see a 2 gauge exceed, that usually means that you're a character who wants to exceed early because it
Right.
provides a lot of value.
They're kind of underlining that as and they're trying to like make it more enticing for you to flip.
Yeah, and so we'll get back to numbers a bunch, but basically his Devers is very good at spending gauge for force. He's either getting double or triple value out of it. So spending a life for that is maybe fine, but it's only fine if you're not being like actively pressured and need to respond, right? It like really doesn't change game state all that much. Your ultras aren't that scary.
Right.
You're like you don't really have any gauge expenditures. So this is kind of a oh, I'm not like hitting and getting gauge reliably type problem. So don't treat this as a, mash this button. It's not a button you mash. It's bad at
Right.
that.
So you might be using this in the early game in order to get to your exceed mode, but after that, are you kind of hoping that your engine is going to sustain itself?
Yeah, and you might not even use it in the early game because if you just hit them with something, you're better off, to be honest.
Sure. I mean, you do have these cards over here that work
Yeah.
completely fine without force expenditures on top of them.
Yep.
Okay.
So, all right, let's talk about cards, and let's start by talking about Marked for Death. So, Marked for Death is like the classic Devris card, right? It's a 3/5/3 that can before spend up to 3 force. This card is really hard to just beat clean. You can maybe dive it and you can spike it on on your offense, his defense,
Right.
but if they grasp you, so let's pull some characters up to think about how this card like really
Yeah,
works.
sure.
This
I
is a
got I
weird
got
card.
I got a training dummy here if we need
Yeah, we
one.
got our classic Ryu. So if, so first things first, if they grasp you and you have Marked for Death, you probably still hit back, right? Um, the only time you can't hit back, I think, is if they grasp you like in this exact situation where moving 3 doesn't let you get to 3 because you'd have to
Right.
move, 4.
Right.
Um, unless you're in exactly this situation, you're fine. You counterattack. I think if you cross at 2, yeah, you're basically never going to be able to evade this with cross because you go here, he moves 1. You go here, he moves 2. So what that means is that as long as you can spend between 0 and 3 force, you'll beat basically anything that requires range to dodge you unless the corner is in play. Right? Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And
So
with three speed 5 guard is safe enough for many attacks in the game that this is probably just going to go off.
yeah, this crumbles if they get, plus a bunch of power. Like if you throw fierce on something, this might
Right.
blow up. But
Or
other than
or
that, it's
as
pretty likely.
always, Ryu is a bad example for our training dummy because he has things like Donkey Kick that hits harder than they should. But uh, it, most of the time against most characters, 5 guard, 3 speed is it's faster than sweep. It'll probably be fine.
Yeah. So, it's a real concern that you have to deal with like heavy things. And that is actually one of his consistent weaknesses. You'll see he's got like a 4 guard and a 5 guard and a 5 guard,
Right.
but he doesn't have a 6 and he doesn't have really that much plus guard. So that is
And
a real
he
concern
and
for
he's
him.
not that fast, so he's relying on those slower options going off in the first
Yeah.
place. And if they don't, he's in trouble.
But so this is kind of the shape of a card, which is it's a reliable shape, right?
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
likely to hit, but its reliability is tied to force. So the goal of the opponent might not be to not trade with it. Their goal might be to make you spend as much as possible.
Sure. Okay.
Which,
So if they play Hadoken here, um, you trade up for effectively for free.
yeah,
If
if
they
it's
played cross instead in this position, they are maybe you traded up, but did you trade up by 3 force worth?
yeah, exactly, or
Okay,
2 force in this case because you have to close 2.
2 exactly. Okay,
So it's worth noting that the difference between 2 and 3 can be pretty substantial, right? Because I have double value, so 3 force is 2 cards, and 2 force is probably 1 card.
right. Okay.
So he has these weird breakpoints in that sense, and remember that because that's going to come up a lot.
So
There's a
so
reason 3 is an important number.
and obviously my exceed mode is going to change that breakpoint pretty substantially. But so in the same way that like spending an ultra as force, uh, on a block, for example, those weird uh odd numbered damage values that you're blocking when in order to completely nullify the damage and get it into your gauge, you need to spend like 1 extra card or 1 extra force in order to
Yeah,
nudge it
exactly.
underneath the breakpoint. I get you. Okay.
And people usually let that slide, but when you really need that extra 1 force, for example, if it's going to let you hit, it's a big deal.
Right. Right. Okay.
So yeah, so Mark for Death, it's kind of a straightforward card. It's good. It tends to reward the opponent from getting to. They want to get like exactly 6 away from you, so you spend the full 3, or somewhere near corner. Like if it's something like this, then you have to spend the full 3 to advance 3.
Right.
But it's just a good card. It'll hit pretty reliably, and hitting reliably is always nice. It helps you close games, even if you do have trade issues. But
So, I,
it's a useful role player. It really highlights his whole force economy.
in this situation where I I I play this exact card here, and I'm forced to spend the full 3 force to hit with this. Now it goes to
Yep.
gauge because I've hit with it,
Yep.
and I have 2 force engage from this.
Yep.
So it overall, as long as I'm hitting, my net force expenditure when playing this
Yeah, it's
card
not too bad.
is -1. When it's this, it's 0.
Well, you did spend a card from hand on the strike, but
I
yes,
see.
it's
Okay. I get you. That it is still striking is resource negative always, but just less so in that
yep.
situation. Okay. Okay.
So yeah, so Mark for Death is kind of a classic, but like you mentioned, reliable hitting is really important because he gets better value out of Gauge, so he loves Gauge. Dark Strength is sort of the other half of this. Dark Strength should look familiar. It's going to read a lot like Bad Moon because
Yep.
it is a lot like Bad Moon. But
That's less
there's
shaker.
three. Oh, sorry, yeah, Lust Shaker. Bad Moon's boost, Lust Shaker.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
There's three major differences. The first major difference is that it lets you spend up to 4 force instead of 3.
Right.
And potentially generating +4 force is like way better than +3 force in terms of destroying things. Like Assault now gets to beat Focus, which is pretty nice. You can like Grasp trades perfectly into Sweep in terms of damage. And sorry, no, Grasp
Yeah.
crushes
Yeah.
Sweep. Grasp,
No,
yeah, Grasp crushes Sweep. Assault crushes Focus. Yeah,
yeah.
you're pretty
Th-
much set.
those are pretty crazy damage values.
Yeah, unlike Lust Shaker, this doesn't, spend. This can't be canceled,
Sure.
which
This is
is
this is a neutral action that you're taking.
yeah. So your opponent gets a chance to deal with it, and in general, that's why Devris is pretty fair. Pretty much everything he does is tempo intensive, and the opponent has time to deal with it.
Right.
But if they let you strike into them with Dark Strength, it's pretty scary. The other thing about Dark Strength is that Devris is a character, unlike Amelia, who's pretty good at generating force, right? Like he can make 4 force with his ability once he has Gauge. The hard part is getting the Gauge.
Right. Okay.
So this is a boost we may need to get back to, where like it's really good. If you play it and then it's card neutral because you get to draw a card. You do spend a Mark for Death, which is like annoying but not the end of the world. I'm also not really sure what's going on in that art. It's like a tiger with the death kanji on it. Are you like just pointing at the tiger and being like, "Oh, I'll murder you" or something? I don't know.
Or is the
Um,
tiger coming to murder you? It's hard to say.
no, I feel like you're calling it
You're
the tiger's or
y-
fox. I don't. That looks like a tiger.
you're gonna kill the tiger
Um,
fox. Okay.
I guess sucks to be that.
I guess
Damn, that's
so.
rude.
Huh.
But it's very rude. But yeah, so like Dark Strength is basically yeah. Anyone who plays Mage Wars, if you know the lore, please drop a shout out or something.
Yeah, actually, I would love to
Um,
know anything about this character. Apparently, he wants more power. That's what I got from his character quote. That's all
yeah,
I got.
he's one of the like title cover characters from Mage Wars, I think.
Yep.
Uh, unlike I feel like Raedric Blackforge from who was in BattleCon is in the same boat.
Oh,
Anyways,
okay.
he's also got a really weird character profile art. He looks really cursed in his little bubble on the top right on these cards. But
He really does. So in terms of Mark for Death and Dark Strength, just to uh, the standard evaluations apply about like it sounds like I'm using this boost when it's good. I'm using this attack when it's good. I'll use both
yeah,
sides of this
this
card.
it's a perfectly fine card. Both sides can be extremely scary, but are often like pretty good. The main thing is like how the opponent deals with them. If I'm a fast, wants to stun you evasive pokey character, this card is really hard to fast evasive poke stun. Right? It's got huge range, it's got huge guard, it hits pretty hard. It's just annoying. Um if I'm hitting you hard, if I'm trying to hit him hard, or if I'm trying to hit him with a mid speed, like this card is garbage.
Right.
So it's really about the context. Dark Strength is basically always good as long as the opponent doesn't have an opportunity to just win a strike clean.
Right.
But even then, the worst case is like you drew a card to replace it. So it's not the end of the world.
The couple questions I have about Dark Strength then. So I'm noticing actually for both sides of this card that pretty frequently throughout Devris's kit, with the exception of a couple of just really really expensive boosts like Infernal Power,
Yep.
um, almost all of the things that I'm spending are things like before actions or hit action or before effects or hit
Yep.
effects. So I
That's
I
really important.
I have the ability to see what my opponent is doing before I spend anything. So in the case of Dark Strength, if I throw an assault and they throw a sweep, I'm probably spending 3 and not 4, assuming that I don't need this ignoring this particular the peculiarities of his breakpoint math with his gauge. I can spend to what I need, not the entire amount if they don't throw the focus.
Exactly. And if you're not going to hit, like if they empty cross, you just don't spend.
You just don't spend it all. Sure, okay.
So
Um,
you have a lot of flexibility.
right, and because I'm seeing what my opponent is doing, I sort of have an uncommon amount of control over what my attack is supposed to be beating once I see what they're throwing.
Yep.
Um, skipping ahead into a quick sidebar about economy in general, because this is something that actually draws you a card. It occurs to me that you can also just spend force from hand. Um, is that something that how do I ask this question? So obviously it's double or triple efficient to do it from gauge. So I want to be doing it from gauge all the time. Um, is it realistic to never spend force from hand as Devris because he has uh does he have enough problems generating gauge that I will occasionally have to dip him into my hand to spend?
So that's a really good question that we're gonna talk about with his boost kit,
Okay.
because his kit as a whole has a lot of interesting answers to that. But the basic idea is that your gauge is really valuable, so you want to preserve it as much as possible. In a situation like Marked for Death, if I'm spending 3 force, I probably want to spend two from gauge, or one from gauge for 2 force, and one from hand, for
Right.
example.
Right.
Or Dark Strike, make 3 from gauge and one from hand, if I need to do it that way, because there's a couple of reasons that you might want your gauge to be as heavy as possible, consistently. But in general, your goal is to get as much gauge and then to spend as effectively as possible. That will involve spending from hand sometimes.
Okay. No, makes
The
sense. I got you.
downside is that, like, getting things into your hand is tempo expensive. Getting things into your gauge is not really, like, unless you're using your ability. You sort of get things into your gauge passively, but like getting things into your hand, you don't want to be spending turns rebuilding your hand if you can avoid it. So that's the
Right.
hard part. And
Okay.
your
And
cards are
and
all pretty decent.
and also, I mean, the idea that I have already hit with a card, it has gone to gauge, and now I can sort of double dip on the same resource. Uh, I already played a card. I already got value out of it. Now it's in my gauge. I can get more value out of it. That is often more enticing than just spending something from hand because I haven't done anything else with that card yet. Is that kind of how I should be
Exactly.
thinking about it? Okay.
Exactly. I
Okay.
mean, you only have so many opportunities to hit with cards, right? You only, if you have 6 strikes in a game, or 8 strikes in a game, or 10 strikes in a game, like that's only 10 cards that can go into gauge
Right.
necessarily.
And you
So
you
it's
clearly don't need to hit with every card in your deck to win a game.
yeah, but the main thing is that a card in if you're not going to play that card in a strike, then like who cares? It's probably not going to gauge anyways.
Right.
But if you think you're going to play it in a strike, you might not want to spend it. You might want to spend it. It's like I said earlier, Devers is legitimately quite complicated because he's got a lot of like, how much do you think your things are going to be worth now versus later versus in this situation,
Right.
and that's just not common.
If you did manage to get that assault that you just were hoping to spend into your gauge, uh, it would be worth double or triple later on. But so how much do you need to spend right now? You have to ask complicated questions like that.
Exactly.
I
So
gotcha.
yeah, so Mark for Death, I mentioned earlier, like there's a reason that people will try and like run away and get you to move in. Mark for Death also does have the benefit of it brings you to range 3, and you're pretty good at range 3, so keep that in mind.
Okay.
But the counterpart to Mark for Death is your other range manipulating card, which is Summon Assailants, aka just send some guys to beat him up. So this card is very weird, and this card is also bonkers. Like, this card is incredibly good.
Yeah, this could hit
So,
for 10.
so yeah, let's explain how this card works. So Summon Assailants basically says it's a 1/4/4 with 4 guards, so it's pretty reliable actually. And then wherever the opponent is, you spend force equal to the distance after, like the difference between where they are and 1. So if he is 4 spaces away, you have to spend 3 force, and you get a bonus power for each force you spend. So in this entirely reasonable situation, it's hitting for 7.
Right.
4, 5, 6, 7. In this situation, it would be 8. In this situation, it would be 9. In this situation, it would be 10. In this situation, it would miss
It would actually
because you
whiff
can't.
at
Yeah,
at full board. But so because it increases the minimum and maximum range of the attack simultaneously, I am not throwing a 1 to 7 uh a range 1 to range 7 card with variable power. I am throwing a range 1 card with 4 power, a range 2 card with 5 power, a range 3 card with 6 power,
yep,
et cetera
yeah.
as we
You're
go.
throwing a range 1 to 7 card that gets like more expensive and also more powerful the further they
The
are.
further the further away they are. So if I was like awesome, I'm going to spend 6 force in this situation to hit for 10, I would whiff.
Yes, you have to choose the exact amount of power based on where they are.
Right. Okay.
So this card is insane. Like this card hits super hard. This is basically the biggest possible threat. People will respect this really hard. It's got 4 guard, and as you sort of probably have run into from doing a lot of these, when people talk about how projectiles work, this is kind of like one of the apex mid-speed projectiles, if you think
Yeah.
about it.
A lot of
Like
mid-speed projectiles don't hit for 10.
this is basically if you gave Kendoken 4 guard and potentially even more power.
Yeah.
'Cause it's got the Ken and also no min range issue.
Even just at Kendoken's minimum range of 3, it's still hitting for the amount of damage that Kendoken would hit for.
Yep, and has 4 guard in the process.
That's crazy. I mean, obviously, Kendoken also does not cost any force on its before effect, but
It does cost a gauge. It does cost a
yeah,
gauge if you're hitting it for that much
for
power.
its crit. But
And this
but
doesn't recur. Fortunately, this would be busted if it recurred.
so this is a way to pretty definitively win a lot of fireball wars.
Yes, and also it's a way to make the opponent really scared of crossing.
Hmm. Okay.
This is a brutal cross counter.
Yeah, I mean, either you catch them on the cross at range 2 because it's still hitting at range 2, or you know they cross out and then next turn you just throw this.
Yeah, like if you strike it at range 2, for example, and they cross, if you struck with this, or if they struck with cross into you, and like, so if you're here, right? If they're striking into you with any normal, and you just play summon assailants, like what are they going to do? If they assault, you're a little sad. You just trade evenly,
Right.
which is your worst case. If they dive, you double whiff. If they cross, you hit them for 8. If they like you trade, I guess you trade down if they sweep or focus, which is a little annoying, but it's still like not that bad.
Sure.
The main thing is the guaranteed value is if they either can't hit you or if they are playing a long range game, and this card makes it very dangerous to play a long range game with him. And
Okay.
uh, unlike most projectiles, this card is non-committal, meaning you're not like playing with a big min range gap that dive can beat.
Right.
And it hits like a slow projectile despite having the stats of a mid speed projectile. So like, yeah, this card is really the linchpin of a lot of your game plans. If Mark for Death is like your reliable card that is expensive but hits moderately hard, this is your reliable card that's expensive but just
but
wrecks
but
them.
destroys the opponent. Sure. So and when
The
you mentioned not having a minimum range to dive over, my
Yeah,
opponent could deny me a little bit of power by moving in, but
yes, they could
they're
deny
still
you some power.
they're still taking the hit, and maybe I'm spending less force. That sounds okay. Um, is the threat of this card most of the time just mean that my opponent is gonna be in ranges where it's not too scary?
Sort of. There are two major downsides to this card. The first one is that this is your only ranged card. So if you like telegraph this card and they parry it, you're like, I don't know, what do I do now?
Right.
Um, or if they block it, or if they dive in and happen to have a good trade card, or if they throw a mid speed projectile that moves you or something, if they have a way of dealing with this card, you don't have any mix up here. Like you just only have this card. Like your mix up is marked for death, and that's really not that scary.
Sure.
So that's a concern. The other concern is that this card can be quite expensive. Hitting for 9 is great. You are spending 5 force in the process. You only
Right.
have so much force. So while this is basically your best payout, and you'll notice like a lot of 1 force for 1 power, meaning that you need to actually convert force into power, which this card is great at doing. It can be really a problem if you overspend and you have just no follow up.
Right. Okay. So, but because this is so scary, my opponent is at least incentivized to stick to have answers to this, or to stick fairly close to me where this is less dangerous. Does that mean
Yes.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let's say so you do have some like range preferences, like this is above curve at 3, this is really a range 3 card, this is a range 3 card. So if they want to stay at 2, for example, this card's not that scary at 1 or 2, and your range 1 or 2 game is like fine, I guess. At 4, this is the only card you have that hits. So those are kind of the two the notable ranges. Like one, as long as they avoid 3 and maybe 2, um, they can really mitigate this.
But 3 is a range for a lot of my other stuff. So that
Yeah,
is
so they want to avoid
challenging for
3.
them. Right. Okay, I
Yeah.
get you. So realistically, I am not a zoner other than this card. And maybe marked for death. So my opponent is going to be playing around this card. Does that mean that I will occasionally just have to use it at range 1 or 2 because that's where they are, or am I really trying to hold this card as a threat to keep them from ever running away from me?
So here's where things get interesting. Your mobility is not awful, but it's pretty bad.
Okay.
You have one movement card, and it's the ability on Mark for Death, which forces you to move to 3. You have no other movement.
Right. And other than just efficient force expenditure from Gauge letting
Yes,
you hop
you do
around a
have
little bit.
that.
Okay.
So your mobility is very weird and janky, and Mark for Death is more of an anti-zoning tool than it is like a zoning tool, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's good at getting you into 3, but it's not good at moving you around. So the opponent against Devris has a lot of ability to choose what they want to do in general.
Right.
And so if they want to fight at 1, you can't really say no. You have normals. That's it. So that is a strong incentive to fight Devris at 1.
Okay. Okay.
Um,
The I don't really have the ability to set up this card myself. This is a threat for my opponent to deal with if they happen to cross out, and disincentivizing them to cross out it sounds great because the rest of my stuff
yep.
probably can't deal with it. But maybe I shouldn't be expecting this card to be like hitting this card should probably not be integral to my game plan because my opponent is not going to let me have it a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's really not that common to hit this for 7 to 9 power.
Okay, sure,
You'll probably hit it for 6 reasonably, or 5, and
sure,
certainly 4 is trivial. But
sure.
hitting
The
it for those big numbers is not actually that common.
the presence of this card in my kit is still going to do work by keeping my opponent from running away from me, uh,
Yeah,
regardless of whether I hit with it or not.
yeah.
Okay,
And
I
with
get you.
that said, the boost on this card is excellent. So
That is a
Lash of
big boost.
Hellfire, yeah, range plus 0 to 1 range plus 1 speed is just super good. It does a lot of a lot of things that you might want out of a boost. Again, you're kind of hard pressed. So this boost is weird. It is difficult for you to choose range because you're not very mobile. It is also difficult for you so it's difficult for you to get to the optimal position where you necessarily want to use Lash of Hellfire, if that makes sense. Because like this is a card where if the opponent is like hugging range 2 or 3, you can do, but you're like already good at those ranges.
Sure.
So yeah, like it's really good. It's a little awkward. Never like I'm never gonna turn it down. But if I'm like using this to threaten a ranger, I might just be better off playing Summoned Assailants,
Right.
which is a weird thing to say for a boost this good.
For extreme range stuff, but for sort of this mid range play where I'd be putting it on my normals, um,
Yeah.
that's what maybe that's for. So in terms of like combos that we'd be looking for with this, just among the normals, like yes, I would love to play a range 3 dive that's on curve. I would just from the speed. I would love to play an above curve grasp that beats sweep. Any other like important combos I should be aware of for this card?
Mm, it's like plus 0 on range is actually pretty decent with focus, for surprisingly enough, but like the speed is not that helpful.
Right.
Obviously spike, like this makes it into like the Yuzu spike ranges.
Sure, yeah, you get kind of like a pseudo projectile.
Yeah, to 2 to 4 with 4 speed, ignore armor guard is pretty
Yeah,
solid.
that's really scary
But
actually.
in general, this card is just kind of a role like a player. It does work, but it's not going to be the thing that makes or breaks it. While the attack might actually
It
be.
actually legitimately might. Do I have to be worried about dropping my second copy of Summoned Assailants because of how important it is as a threat?
It depends on the matchup a bit because, so for
Okay,
example, in this situation, right, Ryu does have an answer to summon assailants because he's got his Metsuhado. So if he has an ultra, he can deal with it consistently. So in that situation, you might be more interested in like playing Lash of Hellfire or trying to bait out Metsuhado somehow. Um, and working around that.
Right.
However, the the benefit is really high, and this card like shuts down auto loops somewhat. You trade up super hard once, and then he recurs and you don't. So it's complicated.
Right. Sure. Sure. Okay.
Yeah,
But so
so like
so
legitimately, it's really character dependent and situation dependent, and they're both viable.
sure. If I'm up against Zangief, who's never going to cross out on me anyway, uh, I probably don't need to be holding both copies of Lash of Hellfire.
Yeah, yeah. You probably don't
Okay.
need two summons balance against Geef.
Okay.
All right, so let's
Makes
let's go to
sense.
Phantasmal Might a little bit because this talks about the sub theme of Devris. So Phantasmal Might is a strange card. It's kind of bad to be honest. Like 1 to 2 2 5. Is not a great stat line even with potential +4 force. EX, it's pretty scary actually.
Yeah. On curve, break sweep. Those
Yeah,
are good numbers to have.
it's
On
good
curve,
numbers.
especially catches cross as well, which is great.
Yeah, so EX's card is really, really good, but expensive because you're spending force on top of 2 cards from hand. Not
Right.
EX'd, it's fine, unless you can give it stats somehow, which we'll talk about. But
Right.
like, it's good with boosts to an extent. On its own,
It's like a
it's
mid
good
speed
with
that
Lash of
doesn't
Health.
beat it. It's like a mid speed that doesn't beat anything.
Yeah, with Lash of Hellfire, it can actually be pretty annoying, especially at range 3. But then you have to deal with the fact that you just invested a bunch.
Right.
So this card is fine. Like, there's a similar card that's more important. We'll talk later about. Pursuit of Knowledge is the one that I actually want to talk about. So Pursuit of Knowledge is the other one of Devers' sub themes, which is that like not only do you want to spend resources, you're also rewarded for hoarding resources.
Oh,
Now
okay.
you
So
see the
so
problem.
yeah, yeah, okay. So I just cashed out on summoned assailants, spent a whole bunch of gauge in the process, and now I can't use Pursuit of Knowledge anymore.
Yes. So you need to decide sort of the flow of your kit because you're really heavily rewarded for cash outs, but you're also rewarded for not cashing out.
Right.
And so doing those in the right order is great if the game lets you, but that's not always going to be the case.
Okay.
So Pursuit of Knowledge is potentially phenomenal and potentially terrible. And if you can maximize it, if you can get at least 3 to 4 gauge when you play it, then like great. This card rules. If not, then this card, both sides of it are like kind of meh. And so you might spend it as force, but also like the benefit on a character who has bad economy of potentially drawing like 4 to 6 cards in one action is quite high.
Sure.
So that's just a thing to think about. Like it's hard for me to give you strategic advice, but if you think you're in a position where you're going to be hoarding gauge, like absolutely this boost is excellent.
Right. So I'm also like all of these awesome payout effects that interact with my ability to generate force from gauge are cool, but like how I mean I my question is like Guile as our point of comparison is not particularly known for having a bad economy because he could just change cards really efficiently, right?
Yeah.
So I have Pursuit of Knowledge that draws a card for each card in my gauge, but the the change cards action, I guess the difference is that it doesn't spend the gauge, right? That's the
Yeah.
obvious thing that I'm
And
missing
that's a
here.
big
That's a
difference.
big deal for a payout character, of course. But so if all I'm looking for, and I won't be only looking for this because I want payouts too, but if all I was looking for is to reload my hand
Yep.
and I had 4 gauge to spend, that's an entire hand reload. But
Yep. I mean 3 gauge is an entire hand to be honest.
right, yeah, yeah, because you'll draw for end of turn as well. Yeah,
Or 2 if you're exceeded.
you'll cap back out, right? So I guess the value of this card is that it lets you do that while still threatening payouts for later, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha. All right, yeah, that seems like a big deal given what we've already seen what he can do with his gauge.
Yep. And so let's talk about the next card, the other card with that sub theme, which is Combustion. So
Okay.
Combustion, 2 to 3 6 2 +1 speed for each card in your gauge. So realistically, this is like a 2 to 3 6 5 a lot of the time, which is pretty nice. It's an assault at 6 power that doesn't move you.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
that's perfectly fine. It honestly it feels a little bit like this, except it's a poke instead of a mid speed.
yeah, you can get it faster. At which point, if once 2 to 3 6 6 is good. I mean, that's like the
Sure.
bison. That's the classic bison shape.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's an ultra.
2 to 3 6 2 to 3 6 7. Yeah, and this is like a 1 gauge ultra, right? On hit, you discard a gauge. Um, you could play this without any gauge and not have to discard a gauge, but also it's bad if you do that.
It's
So don't
yeah,
do that.
it's a terrible card then.
So yeah, so this card is basically gonna. It's pretty reliable. It's hard to dodge, right? Once it's powered up. It's really satisfying. You just get to chunk people for 6. There's not really anything they can do about it. Um, that's all it does, right? It doesn't have any kit riders. It's literally just you hit them hard. Doesn't do anything else. The nice thing about combustion is that if you have more than 4 gauge, this card is really annoying on defense. And even if you have 4 potentially, because it beats assault. Having like a above curve whirl type card, like those 2 to 3 that hits for
Hits for
6,
6. Yeah, that's
is just
pretty
super
insane.
annoying.
Right.
So this is like the theme kind of in the same thing as Pursuit of Knowledge, right? It's if you do hoard gauge and your opponent like expects you to cash out or you're just sitting on it, this card can really mess with people's happiness and well being and also it's a pretty good kill card as a
Sure.
6. So in that sense, like it's one of those cards that's kind of hard to use, but when the opponent is vulnerable to it and when you're set up for it, it's like really annoying. And it can be really scary.
Okay, so I'm looking to I guess it's a separate line of play for Devris that involves hoarding more than spending. If
Yep,
I'm
and you sort
if
of hold a threat over somebody for a little bit.
right, to kind of slow the pace of the game down to keep them from striking into me at 3.
Yeah.
Honestly, it feels kind of like Sparkbolt on Tager.
Yeah,
Um
yeah, it's kinda like Sparkbolt.
with a little bit like he does not have the same kind of like grappler dynamics idea, but like having a big scary gauge payout in Tager Buster. And oh, but wait, I also have a really great range 3 reversal in Sparkbolt when I have enough gauge to do that.
Yeah, and sort of King of Taker also.
Totally, totally. So I've got this tension between whether I want to pay out or whether I want to hold this over my
Yep.
opponent's head. Um, in terms of sort of the long-term game plan, it seems like I would be using this opportunistically rather than have it be my end game, rather my end goal, right? If I draw it late in the game and I have a lot of gauge, maybe it is my end game. But it seems like I'm less likely to go into the game being like, all right, this is a hoarding game
Yeah,
compared
you won't
to
know until it shows up and you sort of assess the game state,
right.
and see whether you played the cards like, if you're hitting with a bunch of normals and you don't have to spend, this card is suddenly way better. If you're hitting with a bunch of specials and you do kinda have to spend, then this card looks kinda worse,
I
right?
see. Okay, so
It's
so
kind of
I
just you have to see how it flows.
yeah, I guess so. My default game plan probably involves more spending than hoarding. Um,
Yeah, by a little bit.
Okay, but these 2 effects, and there may be more that we haven't talked about yet, but these 2 effects are important enough to my game plan, or my game plans, plural, that I should be ready to pivot to a hoarding mentality when I need to if these cards have come up.
Yes,
Okay,
agree.
cool, gotcha.
And so the counterpart to this is Infernal Armor. So there's two of these cards in his kit, Infernal Armor and one we haven't talked about yet on Drain Life, which are very, very expensive boosts that are very powerful.
Right.
Infernal Armor, 4 armor, 2 guard is a buttload.
Yeah.
Right. One of the most, I think, armor in anything without really an inherent stat downside at a pretty high cost. So it costs 3 force, which is either usually a card from Gauge and a card from hand, or if you're exceeded, just 1 card from Gauge.
Right.
That's like honestly one of the nice reasons to exceed.
Is getting a
Yeah,
substantially cheaper infernal armor,
and
not just regular
and
cheaper.
worth mentioning, if you are hoarding Gauge, you may want to not exceed for a bit, at least not until you've done like a Pursuit of Knowledge type play,
Mm.
because the exceed does cost 2 Gauge, and you're not, and it's really only rewards your spending.
Oh, sure, I see. Yeah, you
So
don't
there's this weird dynamic there too.
when you've exceeded the number of cards you have engaged aren't changing in a way that would affect pursuit of knowledge or combustion.
Well, it's going down by 2, right?
Oh
Because
no, I
you're
see what you mean.
spending 2 gauge.
The efficiency of your gauge expenditure does not populate your
Yes,
gauge with more cards, is what I mean. Yeah.
correct.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Um, it's come up a couple times now. We haven't actually talked about it. Should I be expecting to exceed more often than not as Devris, or is the gauge sync not always worth the efficiency
It
later on?
it really depends on the game plan. If you have a bunch of gauge and you think the opponent is going to be more vulnerable to like playing the big infernal armor and the big cash out cards, then flipping is good.
Okay.
Because so exceeding costs you an action and basically spends 4 force, right? Because you're spending
For
2
potential
gauge, which is
force,
4
right?
force.
That could have been or 6 even. It could have been 6 force.
Well, no, because then you
Oh, then you wouldn't
wait.
have exceeded. You'll have caused a
Yeah,
time
so it's
paradox. Okay.
4 force, and
Right.
then if you spend more than 4 force, really more than like 5, well, let's say more than 6 force after exceeding, because let's say you prepared instead of exceeding to get 2 cards, which is about 2 force. If you made more than about like 6 force after exceeding with the ability, then it's worth it.
Right.
If not, it's probably not worth it.
Because
That's like actually a legitimately interesting question, right? If you
sure, and
exceed really early, then maybe, but then you're like spending a bunch of resources early that you could use to threaten things.
right.
So like
So
it's weird.
so you're trying to account for the math you're trying to do is accounting for the force the potential force that you're spending, but also the turn off that you're spending.
Yeah.
In order to and also not having things in your gauge to be able to threaten other things for a while.
Yep.
So all of those things, and it is possible for your exceed mode, maybe even probable for your exceed mode to meet or even surpass those costs. But I do need to think about those costs.
Yep. And it also depends on how much you're going to be paying costs in multiples of 3,
Sure. Yeah.
because like
Hence
if
infernal
it
armor
saves you a
being a
card,
yeah.
so Infernal Armor, Marked for Death, how often you're gonna have to move exactly 3. Summon Assailants is probably gonna save you at least 1 card, maybe 2.
Right.
So on if you're spending 1 or 2 force, it saves you nothing. If you're spending 3 force, well, actually, I mean that might not be true. So you're spending 1 or 2 force, it saves you nothing. If you're spending 3 force, it saves you 1. If you're spending 4 force, it is complicated because it probably means you spend a gauge and a hand card at that point to generate
Right.
4 instead of
Right.
2 gauge cards, and that's actually much better.
Sure. That
At
matters a lot because now you still have things in your gauge.
Yeah, at 5, you're spending 2 gauge or a gauge and 2 hand instead of 2 gauge and a hand.
Right.
So like it's weird how much it helps you, but it is likely to consistently help you. Um, we'll get back to this. This is a
Okay.
really complicated conversation.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, so yeah, so Infernal Armor really good. A couple of concerns. First, how easy is the opponent at nulling it? How do they have ignore armor? Do they have a lot of like neither player hits type strikes? Do they have extra techs? All those things make it worse. And the characters that do have a lot of that tend to be weak to like just hitting them really hard and fast.
Right.
Characters
Which
like Bang, for example, who tend to be
com-
kind of evasive and have no armor.
combustion feels great into that.
Yeah, if I'm just gonna punch him hard and fast, like cool, that's a good way to beat Bang.
Right.
So, that's a thing to think about. You might want to go the hoarding strat. Um in that case. And like that's just where things kind of play out is, it really is character dependent and situation dependent. As if it wasn't complicated enough.
Of course.
Yeah, so yeah, Combustions is a really cool card. It's like a mini ultra. Play Bison if you want more combustion energy.
Yeah.
Drain Life. This card is terrifying. This card is very, very good. So it's kind of the opposite of Summon Assailants. It is your close mid range card. Opponents will play around this if they can like null double strike your Drain Life. They will.
They'll just dive over you at range 1 or
They
something.
can dive it or they can cross it. Like, it's got a very real mix up with Summon Assailants a lot of the time.
Okay.
Because a lot of things that beat Drain Life tend to lose to Summon Assailants. So Drain Life basically has 7 effective power, right? It's got 4 power, 1 armor, and 2 life
2
gain.
life. Yeah.
It gets an extra gauge, and you can guess how good that is.
Sure. Approximately 2 to 3 force good.
Yeah, and also heals you, and you are a character who has a weird life total issue going
Oh,
on.
sure. I actually already forgot that you have the second thing on
Yeah,
your character ability.
we'll talk more about that in a second, actually.
Okay.
So, yeah, this card it's really annoying. It hits like a truck. It doesn't really hurt the opponent that much. It's only 4 power, but the value you get out of this is like slow fireball or just good. It does put the top card of your deck into your gauge, which can be awkward on a kit that has a couple of cards they rely a lot
They
on.
really really want, sure.
So that part is annoying, but as we've seen in modern Exceed design, there is more of a focus on like putting deck into gauge, so it's less manipulable and it's
Right.
more of an option drain. But it's so much value. You windmill slam this card if they assault into it, or if they if you if you trade with if you play this and they play spike and you trade, or if you play this and they play like sweep and you trade down, like you trade up one basically because you got a gauge and hit for 4, healed by 2, they hit you for 6, so it's a wash, but you get a gauge and lose a card. Like that's fine. You're happy about that. Losing one
Right.
card to gain a gauge is, and both of you went down to 4 life. Actually, you went down 3.
Yeah,
You went down
you went
5
down.
minus 2, so you went down 3.
Right. Okay.
So
Okay.
you traded up 1. But basically, yeah, this card rules. It's the main risk fighting him in close range, or one of the 2 main risks. We haven't talked about the other card yet. Yeah, like this card's really good, and that's the thing about Devris, right? He's got pretty good cards that are situational. This one's less situational. This is just a strong slow that happens to be 3 speed.
This is also, at least the attack side of this card, is the first one that we've talked about that doesn't really have any any sort of it's a gauge generator, which is cool, but it's not a spendy card, it's not a hoardy card.
Nope.
It's just
Yep.
good.
You just play this. It
Okay.
doesn't hit that hard, which is notable. Like 4 power is really not that much, so
Right.
it doesn't really feel like it's doing as much as it is, but it's doing a lot. It's a very good card.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, so I will be hoping to play this a lot.
Yep.
However, I
Yeah,
can't
the
help
flip
but
side of it.
notice that there's a lot of
Yeah, the flip
numbers
side of
on
this
the bottom
is
quarter
Infernal
of this card.
Power.
Yeah.
This is one of the biggest cards in the game. There's really not much that compares to a 6 force boost that gives you +3 power and +3 speed. So, a couple of important questions to ask when you're considering playing this card. First, uh,
Do they
do
have a
they have
tech?
tech? Yeah, do
Right.
they have a tech?
Right.
Do they have a reading? You know, what can they do against this boost? If they can't do much against this boost, then you might get a lot of value out of this. Second, how do you plan to cash out? Right, the obvious card to combo with this is Assault.
Sure.
The second most likely is probably Spike.
Yep, and because
Um,
the one thing that would stop the assault is a focus. Now you've got an answer to the focus, and that answer is on curve even. I'm sorry, at 2 it would be on curve.
yeah, so it doesn't actually stun focus, so you are kind of sad. Like Assault with +3
+3
trade,
hits you to
trades
7,
down.
right, right.
Yeah,
Hence hence
you trade up, but like you spent so much resources.
hence the spike is what I meant by that, is it
Oh
is
yeah, yeah. If you're at range 2 or 3, your spike is on or above curve, hitting for 8, and is it's pretty good. You know,
sure,
cards like this, similar. Whenever you see a +3 power, +3 speed, so like Akuma's version or Promo Knight's version,
a triple
like those are going to
chalice.
be kit. Yeah, triple chalice. Those are going to be kit defining.
Sure,
They're
yeah.
so scary. So Infernal Power is probably worse than Die. Not is it Die 1000 Deaths?
I
It's the
1000
other
does no,
one.
it's, uh, it's the one on make me go back to, like, October here, Andarel. I did Akuma so long ago. I got you. It is
Instant Hell Murder. It's Instant Hell Murder.
yeah, it's, yeah, there we go. If you have 3 or more bonus power plus 3 speed, Akuma will have 3 or more bonus power, he's Akuma.
Yeah, once he's exceeded,
Right,
it's
yeah.
actually, and so that's actually a good comparison because 6 force is quite a substantial expenditure, right? It's 3 cards from Gauge, and once you're exceeded, it's only 2 cards from Gauge,
Right.
and that's a big difference to be for several reasons, right? Like you're spending, so if you're exceeding, you want to have enough Gauge to like throw a big thing, like whether it's Infernal Power or whether it's like a Dark Strength immediately or something. Um, it's a real concern. Like you want to have ways to spend that Gauge ASAP, and this is
Okay.
just one of those concerns.
Okay,
So
so
yeah, so
so
this yeah,
it would be much easier to exceed and then play this card, or play this boost rather, except that
yes,
except that by taking gauge out of my gauge in the first place, cards out of my gauge in the first place, I can't do it immediately anymore. So
yeah. So if you had like 4 Gauge, then you could exceed and then play Infernal Power the next turn.
right. So
Um,
if what I'm trying to do with my exceed mode is gain greater access to my pricier effects instead of gaining more consistent access to, like, the turn to turn maintenance costs of some of my smaller
yeah,
payouts, then I actually this is not a 2 gauge cost. It's more than that.
Yeah, this is a lot like Akuma, right? Akuma really was heavily inspired by this. This
Okay.
is like a 4. It's like a 4 or 5 gauge exceed that costs 2.
Right. And for the comparison for people who haven't seen this lesson, Akuma is a season 3 character. He has critical, so he needs to have a gauge to have an ability at all. So his 2 gauge exceed cost. If he exceeds with 2 gauge, he has nothing in his gauge. There's nothing he can do uh, with his new ability that he has. So Devris, in order to really get value out of this, as you said, needs like 4 or 5 gauge and then spends 2.
Yep.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So speaking of 4 or 5 gauge, let's talk about Firestream.
Excellent
Uh,
segue.
yeah. First things first. Let's not talk about Firestream. Let's talk about the boost. You play this boost. If you get this boost on the first turn, you just like smile. You play it. You lose 4 life. You put the top 3 cards of your deck into your gauge.
Given how
Getting
much, given how much you were talking about how the difficulty with Devris is how do you get cards in your gauge in the first place? This seems like an answer to all of my problems.
Yeah, this boost, you just play it. The card is actually quite good. It spends 2 gauge to add your hand to your gauge, but the problem is adding your hand to your gauge. You have to like do something next turn, and yes, you have advantage, so you can like prepare or you can change cards. I think you're supposed to change cards, to be quite honest. Like the card yells change cards, but if you're not stunning, then like spending a bunch of resources to just get a nice change cards and shuffle your gauge is like not actually that great.
Right.
Pact of Blood rules. So you just do so much more work with resources, and adding 3 cards to your gauge, like cards to your gauge, is just so important. It turns on Pursuit of Knowledge. It turns on Combustion. You play this boost. You maybe don't play it like mid late game when you already have gauge and you're kind of doing your weird economic maneuvering. But early game, always
As,
play it. Mid game, probably play it.
as a starter, it's a guaranteed you have to play it. Otherwise, it's still probably what you're doing.
Yeah, and if the opponent is just like sitting back and boosting and being, like not letting you really strike cleanly, maybe you use Devers' ability to just get a gauge just to keep things moving,
Right.
right? But if you're ever going to use this ability and you ever have Firestream in your hand, you always Pact of Blood instead, basically.
Got it.
You
Okay.
do lose 1 extra life, but you gain 2 actions out of the deal. And like
Right.
most characters would pay 1 life for 2 actions.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the first ultra that we're talking about. So now seems like an okay time to ask this.
Yep.
The way that my character ability is written, each gauge spent provides up to 2 force instead, which means that if I hit with Firestream and then I spent it,
Yep.
it is 2 force, just like it would be with any other character.
Correct. Yeah, gauges don't get special treatment. And when you're exceeded, gauges are 3 force, just like any other card.
Yeah, ultras are not. I mean, they are benefiting from my character ability. They just would have been anyway. They would have been
Yeah,
that
exactly.
cost anyway. Okay, so it's not bad to have hit with it. I guess I have. It's like I am still getting efficient force expenditure when I do have an ultra in my gauge. It's just that I would have had the same efficiency with any other
Yeah, it's
card.
not then it's not especially good either
Okay,
because you're
I got
spending
you.
gauge to play it.
Fair. Okay. Okay. So unlike other characters with like cheap ultras that actually sort of sometimes feel like economic windfalls for you. If you have a 1 gauge ultra, um goes in your gauge, and now you have 2 force engage instead of 1 force engage or something. It's not really doing that, but it's still like
It's still nice, but it's not
yeah.
necessarily better than like playing cross in particular.
Right. Right. Okay. Sure.
Yeah, so Firestream is like it does a couple things. So it gives you advantage, but you have no hand. So unless your character is literally named Galdred, that's not really a great situation to be in.
Right.
Yeah, Hydra Helix is a better card than Firestream. Sue it. So you've got a couple things you can do. The sort of thing the card is yelling at you is like you hit with Firestream, you stun them, you add a bunch of cards in your hand to your gauge, you gain advantage, you change cards with like 3 of those cards you just add to your gauge, and now you have a full hand and you're good to go.
So you would do this if you had like Firestream and then a bunch of dead cards that you wanted to change cards anyway. Because
Yeah.
like if you have anything valuable in your hand, you don't have a choice. You are getting rid of it. Honestly, it feels like what is the Batista card? Zahisho, I think it's called. And there's a similar this thing.
Hmm.
Yeah. This guy. There's a similar
Yeah.
problem.
Yes.
There's a similar problem on this character where awesome, I have a zillion gauge now, and I have advantage. What if I had a sweep and a focus in my hand? What if I had good cards that I wanted to play?
Yep. So these cards are very similar.
Yeah,
Firestream does more damage and has better range. Zahisho has push 3, so it's more it's better defensively or
right,
better like it's harder to deal with basically.
right, and it's
Um,
on a zoner character who kind of wants you to be at range anyway. Yeah,
yeah,
there's
they do also have the dual issues of these are both quite good boosts, right? Like these are both
yeah,
premium boosts that you want to play. So they're
absolutely.
competing pretty negatively with the boost. Devris wants Gauge more than Batista does, I think. So that's a real concern.
Okay,
I mean, Batista likes Gauge, but Devris like craves it.
makes sense. Okay,
If
cool.
Batista wishes that her triple laser was literally just summon assailants, it would make her such a better character.
Wow,
you
yeah.
know, the the payout, the like crazy spend everything payout. Like if that was just literally summon assailants, Batista would be like way better.
I guess that speaks to how messed up summoned assailants is too.
Yeah, you just summon the boys and they beat your opponent up
Yeah,
and they just
yeah,
they die.
rather than the big scary laser, you bring in these two like Castlevania monsters from the card. Cool. All right, so
Yeah.
but similar to that, like finding the hand composition that you would feel comfortable playing Firestream might be sort of tricky. Finding the
Yeah, it's
situation where you would want to play Pact of Blood does not seem hard at all.
no, it's really not. And like if you don't have that, you spend it to move or something because you're what like how else are you gonna move?
Right.
Boost cross, I guess.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, that's Firestream. Um, Demon Bond is a card. It is definitely one of the cards of all time.
Yep.
This card is either insane or really meh, and it's really hard to tell which one it's gonna be. Because remember earlier I said there was like a bunch of incentives to kind of fight him close to not deal with summon assailants.
Yeah.
And he does have a bunch of grasp answers. Like he can deal with cross with Mark for Death or summon assailants or cross. He can deal with grasp with drain life really easily. Mark for Death also does fine into grasp. Summon assailants also trades up into grasp, though it's probably not as much damage as you would have liked. So that kind of implies that you often want to throw slows, even though drain life beats slows. Demon Bond destroys slows.
Yeah.
Like Demon Bond just basically is like, I guess you're dead now. 12 force is a lot of force. It's impractical to pay this much force. There's a couple of situations where Demon Bond really shines. The first thing is that, like Cyrus's Dredge Fury and like a couple of other Ultras, Tigers, for example, you do only pay 1 gauge up front to play it. So if you
Right.
get like stunned out, it's not that big a deal. You're
For for
sad, but you're not
for
like you're not demolished.
for such an insane for such an insane payout, it's surprisingly low commitment.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
like Dredge Fury.
Sure.
That's probably a little worse than Dredge Fury. But the main thing about this card, so 12 to do some basic math, 12 force is 6 cards when you're getting a double price, right?
Right.
6 cards, either normals in your or like any card in your gauge or ultras in your hand, effectively. What that means that this card is annoying. It's hard to pay. It's also kind of hard to hit with. However, when you're exceeded, 12 cards, 12 force is now 4 cards, which is a much better rate.
Sure.
So that's another big reason to exceed is like if you have the resources, like if you exceed and then you play Pact of Blood and then you play this and you're able to, spend 3 cards for 9 power, you're doing great. I mean, you're not necessarily doing better than Summoned Assailants would be, but the ways that people beat Summoned Assailants tend to lose to
And to
this
lose
unless
to
they're
this, right.
boosting like stats.
So the absolute upper end of what Demon Bond can do with its full 12 force expenditure, that is something that even Summon Assailants cannot hit for 12. But if what I'm trying to do is beat Sweeper Focus, I might not need to spend every single card in my gauge on this. It might just be a way to hit for 8 or 9 consistently, or 8 or 10
Yeah,
consistently. Okay.
and like you do only have so much gauge. You're hoping you get Pact of Blood, or maybe the opponent like waffles, prepares, and you can pop of an extra life to get another card into your gauge.
Right.
But you don't love doing that, but it's not terrible. Your boost go game is a little spotty. Like you don't have that many boosts that you could just leverage by sitting there. Dark Strength is a decent boost go. Lash of Hellfire is a good boost go. The expensive ones are, but like that is a commitment. And you have the good normals for boost go. But boost go is like just play a boost, pass turn, let the opponent react to it.
Sure, yeah. The sort of, as you said, one of the things that makes Devris fair is that many of the things that he's doing do have a tempo downside that would give my opponent some room for counterplay.
Yeah.
Right.
This card with +2 speed is just like comedy.
Yeah.
So if you boost light, prepare to, and the opponent stays close range, they boost, I don't know, something that's not also +2 speed or leaving. I mean, I hope they can beat Demon Bond at a reasonable rate.
And if they cross out, awesome. Throw
Yeah,
summon assailants at them.
which stuns their cross, right? If they're on defense.
Oh, fair, yeah.
Yeah, so
Uh,
if you play late and they just chuck the cross, like they might eat combustion, they might eat summon assailants, uh, they might eat phantasmal might, to be honest, if you're feeling a little cheeky. But yeah, so the thing is, right? You've got 1, 2 on the boost, 3, 4 cards that all turn force into power at a +1 to 1 ratio, right?
right, right.
So that's really how you win. You find ways to like get gauge, and then you find ways to get the gauge into power, and you find the ways to get that power into the opponent's face, and hopefully not get hit back because you are spending your life on Pact of Blood and this,
Sure. Okay.
and you're only getting it back with Drain Life, and hopefully you're landing Drain Life. So that's kind of the key of Devris is like finding that weird widget where like you don't want to spend cards necessarily, but also you're like really good at it, but also it's kind of expensive, both short term and long term. The other question you had earlier, remember about spending cards in hand versus Gauge?
Yeah.
This boost is the boost that messes with that whole question. So this is a weird boost. Best case scenario, the opponent is at like 6 or 7 cards in hand, right? You have almost nothing. You have maybe just this or one other card. You play this boost, you get a huge windfall, and they get like nothing, or they discard a card,
They discard like one
or they
card.
draw like one card. Yeah, they get like almost nothing. Either they lose the card, or they gain a card, or like, and you drew like six cards off of it.
Right.
And that's great. You have to engineer that situation basically, but this card kind of punishes the opponent for really sitting back and letting like gathering resources and sort of doing that kind of game plan with Devris because like sure you spent a bunch of cards and maybe you did play an ultra like boost an ultra spend some of this force with an ultra, but also your ultra boosts are all really good, so maybe not. Like again, like I said earlier, Devris is a weird character.
So
Um, but that's a huge windfall, and that does reward you for like consistently either in one big go or repeatedly spending like a little bit of cards from hand instead of Gauge.
so that I can be at a low enough hand size where this gigantic reload could be valuable.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm also noticing like, all right, so even in Devris's kit, none of my stuff is hitting for 12 except for this. But if I compare this to, say, two of my other uh, uh, gauge payout power cards, one thing
Mhm.
I'm noticing is that for this one, in order to hit for what summoned assailants would hit for normally, I need to spend a gauge and 4 force.
Yes.
So this card, every single ounce of its power is uh coming from the force I'm spending. With this card, and especially with this card, they actually hit without it, and then the force is just bolstering the power. So like
Yep.
this is even more expensive than it looks because
Exactly.
12 force is 12 force. 12 power for 12 force is 12 power for 12 force. Um 10 damage for 6 force is quite a bit less than that. Even
Yeah.
6 damage for 4 force is less than that. So
And
does that make Demon Bond slightly like in the tier ranking of my force for power payout options? Am I less likely to use this?
so the tier ranking is this is number 1, right? This is these two are both number 3,
And then
and the
my
boost on this is
boost.
number 2.
Okay, Dark Strength is number 2. Okay, I got you.
Um, and then combustion's combustion. It kind of sits around here. Fire stream is its own thing, and drain life is unrelated.
And conveniently then, both of my big, crazy hand reloads are on my least attractive gauge payout options.
But also, arguably, the ones that are the best at ending games.
Oh, sure, yeah. The the downside of the upside of this is that it does hit harder.
This hits harder. This is easier to make, guaranteed in some ways. You can boost speed, or you can just like play this as a cross counter
Right.
effectively. And these like just chunking people is is value in and of itself. And like, yeah, these can hit really hard, and they're good because of that. But combustion is not always going to be super fast.
And I might not always be in a situation where I can throw summon assailants for maximum power. These
Exactly.
can actually hit really hard, no, like as long as they hit at all. Okay.
Yeah, especially EX Phantasmal Might, which is like an excellent game closer.
Okay. So unfortunately, my heuristic for an easier decision making process is not going to work on Devris because he is complicated.
Yep. Sorry.
Okay. No, that works. All right. So
But yeah, so these like that's kind of the way these work. Like these tend to be the economy during the mid game, unless you are set up where you think you can get like a cheeky spend out of them.
right,
Um, and then as the game gets later, as you get later into the game, they start transitioning into kill cards.
makes sense. Okay. All right. So that is the specials and ultras. That's most of what I got. I do also have these cards over here, and
Yeah, so
we mentioned them a little bit. Yeah.
your normals are all fine. I mean, you're not a character who's like you don't have any ability to buff your normals, right? You've got a bunch of decent boosts that are pretty scary and that like any normal with Lash of Hellfire is going to be really good. Any normal with Infernal Power is going to be insane.
Right.
Any normal with Infernal Armor is
It's
I don't
gonna
know
hit probably.
throwing 4 armor on Grasp like just means that it's guaranteed to trade up.
Yeah.
So he likes every normal. Things that are particularly notable. He is pretty good at or he wants to be at range 3, and assault is a decent like inherent mix up, especially if you like assault into drain life or assault into a phantasmal light type situation. So assault into drain life is a pretty like reasonable combo. You just hit for 4 and then you pop drain life as
And
a
then you play a really really strong Delta card.
yeah,
Okay.
just like assault into sweep is good. This is pretty good.
Sure.
Your cross is nice, but again, you don't really have any follow up to cross. You only really have your summon assailants. Grasp or block is weird. So your economy is good enough that you can vomit force onto block, right? You
True.
just do it.
Right.
However, you don't want to do it, and the fact that you're often like spending potentially a bunch of force on each of the force expenditures, like getting 4 armor instead of 2 on block is not actually that useful. Um, anything that hit like if you're eating like 10 and you want to block that with 2 cards instead of 4, then great. But like you're still spending 4 force in the
Sure.
process, right?
Sure. Yeah.
It's not great.
It's not actually a savings because that 4 force rather could have gone towards something else that could use 4 force.
The flip side, the flip side of that is that the after, just like getting a guaranteed gauge, is excellent.
Sure.
Really good for Devris.
That's two
Parry
force.
also actually reasonable for him. He tends to play a weird neutral game where he cares a lot about specific cards, and so if the opponent's telegraphing a threat that you have trouble dealing with, parry can be really good. Unusually so, I would say.
Okay.
Reading, obviously, on a character who hits like a truck is gonna be good. Reading can be a little weird because reading does spend extra cards, right? Reading you boosted it and struck, so
Right. This
it can
this
be a
would
little
be
expensive.
his only now strike boost in the whole kit, basically.
Yep, yep. So it can be a little expensive, but like it's reading, it's good. You like focus because again, if the opponent can throw like +1 power on their things, you're pretty sad, or +2
Right.
power, and focus is your way of dealing with that. But like reading's reading, hard to argue with that.
Sure. Okay.
Sweep, you're an excellent light user. Again, you have to figure out how to actually hit them, but you can manage that. Sweep is good because you're decent at doing enough damage to kill people from kind of silly numbers sometimes.
This will help
But
you reduce them from full life to silly number where you can kill them because
yeah,
6 damage
and
is a
you're good
lot.
at threatening. You're good at threatening like weird situations where like, okay, if my only answer is if the opponent's like, well, I can kill you guaranteed unless you have an above curve card, then like you have Fire Stream and Combustion, right? You can situationally threaten scary above curve cards. Fire Stream's above curve at range 3, Combustion's potentially above curve at pretty much any range.
Yeah, as long as it's hitting and as long as you got the gauge. Sure, sure.
Yeah, so like if if you're in a weird like checkmate e situation that the only way out is either like a ton of stats or like above curve type stuff, well, you've got a ton of stats kind of on demand as long as you're able to pay for it. And you've got some situational above curve options. You don't really have both at once, but like you can very much live with both people dropping pretty fast. Also, if both people lose a lot of life, that significantly reduces the amount of force you have to spend,
True. Right. Yeah,
which is actually pretty important.
that's a good way to put it. Yeah, if your opponent is at low life, you don't need to throw Demon Bond. You can get away with a smaller force expenditure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a bunch of reasons that you might want to go down. The downside of sweep is that sweep tends to trade, and you don't necessarily have that much life to work with, especially if you've been playing Pact of Blood.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you do this twice, you're 22 life. That's 2 strikes worth of value that you have
Yep.
not hit the opponent for. Okay.
And you are absolutely going to be happy doing this twice.
Right.
You just have to make the numbers work.
Then you just need to kill them more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Spike, it's a little situational. You don't love Spike. Defend's actually not bad. A lot of your cards like get really hard to interact with, but the problem is that your cards tend to lose via like cost and not life. You lose by being forced to spend too much, not by
Or
like running out of
when
life a lot of the
when we were
time.
talking about Marked for Death, you
Yeah.
mentioned like the counterplay to this is making your opponent making you spend to hit them.
So like your cards are already pretty reliable, so you're not as concerned with this card, with defend. And Spike is Spike. It's hard to throw things onto Spike except for your plus speed and range or your so any of your plus speed boosts are great with Spike. Anything else is like fine.
Sure.
Um,
I also I noticed that nowhere in his kit is there any sort of ignore armor at all. And if I'm hitting for 10 or 12 damage, I really don't want to be have my payout blocked.
yeah, there is a natural like combustion Spike mix up,
Right.
right? The things that combustion beats tend to lose to Spike, or things that combustion beats tend to beat Spike, and things that combustion loses to tend to get beaten by Spike.
Sure.
So once combustion is up to a reasonable speed, like 6+, or 5+, especially 6+, once you have 4 gauge, then Spike starts being a lot scarier. But until then, it's a little iffy.
Okay. Makes sense.
So yeah, Spike good if you have 4 gauge, less good if you don't. Dive, same boat. Tech is actually pretty good because your neutral game is so bad that you might have to be worried about boosts. You do tend to play at the ranges where dive is relevant, so be aware of that. Um, all things considered, it's respectable. You do have a little bit of weirdness with Summon Assailants, is that despite being a nutso projectile, Summon Assailants is actually a pretty bad opener.
You just won't have the force to throw with it.
Yeah, you don't have gauge. It loses to dive on defense, and if they cross, you like probably can't even hit them. I mean, you could spend your whole hand to get crossed and hit them for 9. Is that 9? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, it's 9.
If you I mean
So
if you played first, honestly, would you even have enough force for that? If you're
if you
playing.
had ultras in your hand, you would need.
Yeah,
You'd,
that's
you'd need to spend like your whole hand, including ultras,
that's pricey.
because you've got 4 cards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and at least one of them's going to be an ultra. So yeah,
Right.
and hopefully those ultras aren't fire streams, because if you have fire stream, like just do that instead. Like where
Sure,
they're probably
yeah.
Pact of the Tome.
Boost that every
But
single time.
yeah, but also you just spent your whole hand and you just got rid of a Pact of the Tome, which is like the thing that recovers you from spending your whole hand. So
Right.
yes, this is a bad idea. Do not
Right.
recommend.
So your range 4 play probably is, if you're striking, it's probably gonna be dive or a block to get gauge or something.
Yeah, or a Mark for Death.
Yep, that does hit.
It's Mark for Death always hits.
Pretty much. Okay, sounds good. And tech,
Yep.
as you
So
said, tech is valuable because my neutral game's not amazing.
Yeah. So like assault, it's good. It's got movement. It's got advantage. Those are things that you want. It's relatively reliable. Hard to argue with assault. Obviously, good EX, especially on your type of shape. It makes you range one, which is not great, but not like terrible, especially if you've got drain life up.
Yep.
If you don't have drain life up, it's notably worse, which is a little bit of a weird dynamic.
I also want to shout out the enormous spectral hand decking this goblin in the art.
He
Uh,
doesn't even look that decked. He's like,
yeah, he
yo, what
honestly
up?
he's kind of just mean mugging for the camera. I feel like assault is always good. EX assault is always good. Any character who has this as their representation of assault would have a better assault.
I don't even know what he's doing. He's like, I'm not even sure he's like punching that goblin. He's just like shaking his hand menacingly.
Yeah, it could be like an "Oh, you kids, get off my lawn" kind of thing, but with a huge spectral hand. In any
Um,
case, I like the goofy art. I would play this card just for the art.
Sounds good. Cross, it's good. You run into the issue that you have two issues. One of them is that your only real follow up is like running back in or summon assailants.
Yep.
And if you don't have summon assailants, or if they tech summon assailants, you're like, I don't know, what do I do with my life right now?
And you just put
If
down one
you,
cross that you could have used to boost run.
yeah,
Yep.
if they decide to like prepare and you're like stuck not doing anything, then maybe you character action and start bleeding to gauge.
Right.
But it's awkward. Like you don't have a great follow up to cross, but at the same time, it's cross. It's a good card. And then grasp, you get to light Magneto on fire. But
Oh my god, yeah. Magneto,
it's
no.
a good mix up with drain life. It's a perfectly respectable repositioning card that gets you to range 3, where you're happy. Your cards don't actually get that comedically good with Fierce. Like, you don't really have any breakpoints that you particularly care about. It makes Mark for Death break sweep, and it makes Combustion break everything. So those are probably the two that you really want the most.
Right.
Everything else is like kind of you're basically just generating 2 force out of the deal.
Right. Yeah, I mean, fierce combined with uh combustion that has enough gauge to hit above curve is is pretty messed up. And also I like a one force for two power uh trade is better than I'm getting from any of my other payouts. But this one takes a turn, and most of my other gauge costs or
Yeah, and
most of
takes
my
a
before effects don't.
a card from hand as opposed to being a little more flexible about that.
True. Okay.
Yeah,
So
but yeah, the main thing, like you said, is that it takes an action to boost it, and the opponent gets to react.
right. Okay. Okay. I got you. All right. So I'm going to be using pretty much every normal. There's a couple things that require me to evaluate the normals a little bit differently than another character would. Mostly just the presence of my ability to hit really hard and the importance of my force expenditures. So it seems like the biggest thing about these normals is that they're things I can play without having to worry about spending on them.
Yep, and they tend to hit. They tend to go to gauge. You can spend them later. They tend to have good boosts, and they're like really where your movement's coming from.
Right.
Basically, all of your cards, except for like Phantasmal Might and your Ultras, are good attacks. And Phantasmal Might and your Ultras have really good boosts that you may have to work a little bit to set up. In the case of Phantasmal Might and Pact of the Tome,
Right.
but are very very useful. So the sort of default state is like boost or strike. Probably strike by default, but could be a boost. Probably a boost, but could be a strike. Uh, Boost or strike, they're both great. Probably a strike, could be a boost. Probably a boost, could be a strike. Probably a boost, could be a strike.
Right. And until it's time to start throwing those insane haymakers, I'm sort of playing Normal's Man supplemented by these boosts.
Yeah, or normals man supplemented by like the ability to play some silly mix-ups here and there. Like Mark for Death is always nice to have. Drain Life is always nice to have.
Okay. Okay.
Some
So
Assailants is always nice to have.
I it's the the fantasy of Devris being the character who dumps a million force on his turn to nuke his opponent is a completely legitimate real thing. He's got to play a whole game of Exceed before he gets to that point. And in order to do that, he's probably going to be crutching on his normals quite a bit.
Yeah, and he might get to that like in the mid game and then do it, and then have to deal
close
with
the
the
game out.
consequences where he spent a bunch of resources,
Right.
or he might build a bunch of gauge, sit on it, get the free cards out of the pursuit of
Is
knowledge,
yep.
or he might do the exact opposite, like spend all his gauge aggressively, cycle things, get all the cards out of Pact of the Tome instead.
Right.
So like you can either do like a Pursuit of Knowledge plus Demon Bond route. You can do like a Phantasmal Might plus Pact of the Tome route. Like literally the opposite
Yeah. Yeah.
pairings.
It's this and this, or this and this.
Yeah,
I
and like that's
gotcha.
kind of why he's a funky character, right? He's got a lot of really strong tools and a lot of like very clear weaknesses, and you have to make it work, on the fly, depending on what you draw against your opponent's character and whatever they do. Because he's not great at shutting down opponents. He's got no ignore armor and guard. He's got very limited above curve stuff. He
Okay.
starts off kind of weak, and he's got very little
Until he
mobility.
can start affording crazy stuff. Sure, sure. Do we want to move directly into counterplay? It seems like that's where the conversation's going
Yeah,
anyway.
so counterplay is weird for Devris because of the fact that he is a very different character depending on how he's playing the game.
Hmm.
His goal is always get a lot of gauge and then leverage that over you, one way or the other. He can either spend it or use it, but you are often, if he is spending a lot of cards from hand, you might also want to spend a lot of cards in hand so that he doesn't want to play Pact of the Dome. Like he wants to he ends up refilling your hand.
Oh, weird.
So if you go down to like 3-ish, you're getting a lot more value than if you're hovering at like 5 or 6. If you often want to play at close range, but like see if you have a way to deal with drain life. Consider parrying either drain life or summon assailants, depending on which of the two is more threatening. If you're a long range character, summon assailants. If you're a close range character,
Probably
probably
drain
still
life.
summon assailants, but maybe drain life.
Okay.
If you have power, throw power at him. He's really bad at dealing with plus power
Yeah.
because his
All
defenses
these
are all middling.
get other than when he throws infernal armor on things. His gauge, or I'm sorry, his guard is pretty middling at best.
Yeah. Note that he is quite, in fact, weak to range 3 dive, right? Because this loses, this might lose, this misses, this just clean loses, this clean loses, this wins, but like he spent a
He,
bunch, this loses.
and he's not also not playing Pact of Blood.
He's also not playing back to blood. Also, like if you range 3 dive on offense into him, then like his advantage is pointless here. So this is
There.
literally just a weird, funky change cards.
Right. Okay.
Um, so like as you can tell, like this is the range 3 diving into him is really good. Counterpoint, range 3 diving into him spends a tech, and if your techs are down, he starts opening up some bonkers boosts.
That now he doesn't have to worry about the uh potential investment that he's wasting by getting tech. Because I mean, if you pay for this and then you hit with it, you got your value. You're fine.
Yeah, but if you get teched, you're really sad.
If you got tech, it's backbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I got you. Watch out for his big scary cards. Parry the stuff that you can parry. Dive him at range 1 if you can afford the boosts.
Yeah.
Are you
So
mostly trying to just rush him down before he gets to his big scary endgame state?
rushing him down tends to be helpful. Just dumping damage into him is helpful because he doesn't have any like shenanigans at range 1, right? He's got no grasp likes. He's got Fire Stream, I guess, but that's a pretty bad defensive card. It's below curve at 1. So
And he also can't really choose the range of the engagement. So if my opponent is pressuring me at range 1, there might not be a ton that I can do about that super cleanly.
yep. So yeah, generally pressuring him. If you're a ranger, you tend to have like some manipulative tools. Most rangers have some shenanigans. Use those. Respect that you might lose to summon assailants pretty hard, but like if he spends a bunch of life to power up summon assailants and then trades and you take 8 and he takes 4, say, that's fine.
Right. It's
Right?
just that the
If he
game is
spent 4
ending.
life to build the force to spend that to hit for 8,
Yeah, you hit.
then
It's like
that's
you
a
hit.
wash.
Yeah, the game is ending faster than you anticipated, but you're still pretty even on life totals.
Yeah, so that's a concern, but that's not the end of the world. Like, you're gonna have to play around his big hits because he's gonna get big hits, haymakers in somewhere. So it's really a mix of like he's bleeding himself, he's hitting you hard, he is trying to set up for these situations where he can stun you, but he has to go first, but he's not that fast. But like maybe he is that fast, but it's kind of awkward.
Right. So
So
it
it's very play by play situational.
knowing what he's going to be trying to do, given what he has left in his kit, trying to find his roots to kill you, and trying to play around those. Sure, I get you. Um, okay. So that's counterplay, and then the final questions that I have, unless there's any other strategic notes that you wanted to mention about
No, I
Devris
don't
before
think
we
so.
wrap it up.
Like, I'm sorry, I'm being kind of a little unusually vague on this one. He's a very strange character
Oh,
that is
that's
very, very flexible and
no.
requires adapting a lot.
You have nothing to apologize for. This A lot of this is listen. It's going to depend on the situation, kind of
Yeah,
advice, and that's true. So yeah, it's it's not that's not your fault at
yeah.
all.
He's just
Um,
unusually more like that than most characters are.
sure, yeah. All right. So final couple of questions. Number one, any other characters like Devris that if you Devris is an old enough character that if you're like me, viewers at home, you never played season one Exceed. Uh, if Andarel, if you were talking to someone and you found out that a character that a player had a main, who would that main be that would make you be like, oh, hey, you should actually maybe try Devris out?
So Devers is often referred to as like the OG prototype boss character in a lot of ways.
Okay.
He's got that like big economy flow, big payout. So any of the boss characters, meaning Sejun, Bison, Batista, um, Akuma to an extent. Who's got the big spends in season four?
Right?
Fight, yeah, fight to an extent. Treasure King, Polar to an or Spectre to an extent. There's a lot of like sort of relatively ones. Enchantress has the weird economy.
Even
Season four's
Tinker,
got kind of Tinker kind of.
Tink,
A lot of characters share a vibe with him in season four, but are a little less flexible.
right?
Actually, Hakumen I think kind of has a similar energy in some ways. He's more linear, but Hazama actually
Oh,
has a
sure,
lot of that. I think
I can see
Hazama's
that.
still very similar. He's got a kind of clunky economy, but it can be very powerful when it works.
Right,
Nine also that those very specific economy characters where you like get to leverage some occasional big hits.
right,
In season 6 is like Batista. I think is the big one.
right.
Maybe Enkidu has this kind of like swelling gauge management, big like wind up type character kit.
Slow start runs you over in the late game.
Yeah, in season 7, Gold Lewis has a bit of it. He's pretty good about like getting this weird card flow engine going. It's a very different engine, but it can kind of have that.
Mm.
Jacko's got that sort of gauge cycling going on,
Oh, sure,
where
yeah.
you're turning like you're getting extra value out of your gauge.
Similar, uh, spending things very, very carefully too. Her economy is quite tricky to manage.
Yeah, Soul is an easier version of that, where his economy is very much centered around like turning force into power, and
Yep.
your speeds are a little funky. You've got a lot of like situational combos and routes to take. Um, Nago obviously is a very hard particular character. I don't know if there's any like I don't know who the season 7 like boss characters are. Maybe Soul and Gold
Like
Lewis. Happy
like a
Chaos
there's a happy
kinda.
chaos vibe to that, but he doesn't really. I mean, he certainly uses ultras engage in a very different way to Devris, but he is interacting with Gage in kind of a fun way.
Yeah, I could see a Happy Chaos through line where you are manipulating like little bits and pieces of force, and you're trying to turn cards into power in kind of funky ways.
Right. Okay. And then I guess final question. Before I give you your Thursdays back. Uh, if Devris was theorycraft with me for a second, if Devris was time warped forward from the far off year of 2017 or whenever he came out to modern
Sure,
Exceed, um, would he play differently? How would he hang with a modern Exceed meta?
it's a good question. So Devers is kind of like the grandfather of season 5 in a lot of ways.
Oh,
He's
everything's awesome, but it's all too expensive.
Yeah, basically it's all
Okay,
about like managing force widgets. So his action might get cleaned up a little bit. Um, Demon Bomb would probably have a base power somewhere just to make it feel less janky. Drain Life would probably be nerfed. Summon Silence would probably be nerfed. Phantasm Might would maybe be the same or like tweaked a little bit.
Oh, it occurs to me. So the question I meant to ask, this is also a really interesting answer, and I like how you're approaching it. The question I meant to ask would be like, Devris unchanged steps out of the portal and
Oh yeah,
is tournament legal. How would he do
he'd
in that meta?
he'd be fine. He has trouble with the fact that like a lot of the characters in more recent seasons tend to like be able to get small stats and strike because that's
Mhm.
kind of the thing that he doesn't like.
Sure. Yeah,
So he'd be kind
that
of
that
slow. He'd
exact
be kind of clunky.
a little
He
bit
would,
too much power for him to deal with at now strike speed. A lot of people have that now.
yeah, especially that season 7, like +1 power exceeds that get +2 power somewhere and break defenses. But like, dude hits like a freight train, and even though action compression is great, it's not always that good against him because like, sure, I did a bunch of stuff and struck at a nice range, and then now I ate drain life, and that all like goes away, right?
Right.
So spending a bunch of resources into him and then needing time to recover can be really rough because that gives him time to like character ability or time to like prepare and rebuild or whatever. Um, and he's pretty good about that. He'd struggle with the type of things where you have like a Biken type character where they just sort of play kind of canned mix ups and run you over because he's pretty bad into that. But if you're playing kind of a slow, precise neutral into him, his numbers are a lot. He's really good about that. So I think he can hang. I mean, I think he'd be a little bit matchup dependent. Um, I think that if you were told that, in the grand scheme of things, you desperately need a character to play into like, I don't know, Chip or something, he looks at Chip and is like, ah, I see a character who dies to 2 summoned assailants and 2 marked for deaths. I think we're talking
Yeah,
some nice game here.
it's gonna be all right. Okay, I get you. I get you. All right, so some of the weirdness of season one Exceed design would maybe not hold him back, but it would require maybe some slight changes to his strategy and stuff. But really, he's good to go into a modern game of Exceed.
Yeah, he's I mean, I believe he's pretty well balanced. He theoretically has a very high end where like you kind of optimize your ability to hit with things because he is pretty range agnostic. He's pretty good at hitting,
Right.
and you like tweak your spends, but then he's going to be vulnerable to deck order. So it's a little funky. Theoretically, like perfect, everything goes great. Devris is terrifying, but he gives the opponent a lot of counterplay. So
Right.
that's nice and healthy.
All right. Fair enough. Cool. Well, yeah. So anybody who's interested in trying out Devris and like me is started their Exceed career being a little bit intimidated by these older seasons. Sounds like he's fun. Sounds like he's got some cool stuff going on. It also sounds like it would not be the end of the world to want for either player to play this guy into your friends at the kitchen table who are only playing season 5 or season 7 or something like that. So yeah, give him
Yeah,
a try.
no, he's fine. Just like make sure you warn them about summon assailants. That card's a
It's
little
fine.
unintuitive, and it is
And
really rude.
it's unintuitive is one thing, but unintuitive and oh wait, I just hit you for 10 feels pretty bad. So yeah, warn them makes sense. Well,
Yeah,
Anderel, thank you so much for your time and your expertise here. As always, this is our 7th lesson together. I'm so happy that we've covered these characters. Thank you for teaching me all about Devris. Really appreciate it.
yeah, no problem. He's great. Highly recommend.
Yeah, I came in here knowing less than nothing about Devris, and I'm actually really looking forward to trying him out. Folks at home, I hope you learned something as well. Um, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I will see you all for the next one. Goodbye, everybody.
Have a good one.